Welcome to Clienting, the place to get information about legal marketing and client development in the digital age. Here are your hosts, Gyi Sakalakis and Kelly Street.
Hey, Kelly.
Hey, Gyi.
How are you today?
I am doing well. I am actually doing very well because we are recording this after we actually recorded the episode, like right after. And I am jazzed, like jazzercise jazz. Like I want to go take a jazzercise class because I'm very excited.
You got your jazz hands kicking?
Jazz hands.
There they are.
Everyone in audience, we are doing this on video for the first time, and I actually just did jazz hands, so that was pretty great.
Jazzercise.
And no, I didn't do jazzercise. I actually don't know how to do it. Oh, speaking of weird 80s exercise tapes, I have been wanting to, for a while, talk about this glorious Jane Fonda exercise tape that my mom had because I started watching Grace and Frankie on Netflix.
I've heard that's good.
It's good. It's pretty good. It's a little silly.
Okay.
But I adore Jane Fonda. And I am remembering the wondrous exercise tapes that my mom had where she was like, for some reason, next to a hot tub exercising. I think because then she was like, no, I'm going to, chill out my muscles in the hot tub. But like, that's very 80s in her.
Makes sense. I was more of a sweat into the oldies, Richard Simmons kind of guy.
Yeah. Were you really?
Child. No, I really wasn't into it. I remember the commercials, so that's what made me think of it. I never really, I exercised, but I didn't really do like home exercise thing.
No, your mom wasn't doing exercise tapes in the basement like mine was at 5 a.m. and like, come on, come exercise with me.
No, not that I recall.
Okay, so let's not talk about my weird childhood and let's actually talk about our guest for today's podcast. Gyi, I know I was totally mind blown with this guest. I thought he was awesome. What did you think about this guy?
Our listeners are I think I say this a lot. I think we've been very lucky that people have been so generous with their time to come join us on these podcasts. But I've got to say, Tom Fox, not only the Michigan connection, which of course, is near and dear to my heart, but to hear from a lawyer that's been practicing for over 35 years and has really embraced using the web and the benefits of the web to reach a global audience and how he's putting that to work to get clients and grow his practice and serve as an expert. This is a real treat for our listeners today.
Yes, very excited. And here's the episode.
Here we go.
I am a 35-year lawyer. I spent my first 20 years or so in the in-house world. I'm a recovering trial lawyer. Then I moved, in private practice, and I moved to the in-house world. And I became a general counsel at an energy service company here in Houston. I practiced in Houston my entire time. And at that company, we were under a deferred prosecution agreement for a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is a law that prevents U.S. companies from engaging in bribery outside the United States. My company was sold, my job went away. And so I decided that what I really wanted to do with my life was race bicycles. So I went off on this great adventure. I was over 50. I could ride in the senior division. It was before the fall of Lance Armstrong. Of course, he's a Texan. I'm a Texan. So I was a big fan. And that cycling career ended on a training ride one day when I met a Hummer. And that's what led to me being laid up. And so in early 2010, when I finally had enough energy to get on my walker and toddle into my office, I had to figure out what I was going to do because while I was racing bicycles, I said I was practicing law, but I didn't have any clients and I didn't have any work. So I was going to have to do something. And the only thing I had on my hands was time. I'd been working out 4 to 6 hours a day, didn't have any money, didn't have any income. And so I decided to explore the world of social media. At that point, I knew nothing about Twitter. I knew nothing about LinkedIn. I knew nothing about Facebook. I'd heard of blogging, but I didn't engage in it. So I decided to start social media. And the only requirement I had was that it had to be at no cost to me because I had no income. So I had nothing to spend money on. So at that point, you could set up a WordPress site for free. You could do Twitter for free. You could do Facebook for free. So I started doing that. And I started tweeting. And I started a blog. And from that experience, literally within about 9 months, I had a worldwide legal practice focusing on compliance created out of that. The thing that I continue to find the most unusual about my story is not simply that narrative I just gave you, but it was actually Twitter that put me on the map. And I tell people that, and they really, that surprises them. And it put me on the map in the following way. I retweeted everyone in the narrow space of FCPA compliance. I focused on that solely. And after 6 weeks, I got listed on a list of 10 top Twitter feeds to follow for compliance. Then after about 90 days, I started emailing people who had other blog sites. And the email always went along the lines of the following. My name is Tom Fox. I wanted to see if I could submit an article for your consideration for your blog. Everyone came back essentially the same. Oh, we know who you are. You're that guy who retweets us every day and never asks for anything. Send us anything you want. And that's really how it started. And I developed relationships that I still have today, professional relationships that have become friendships with people I met on Twitter. I met sub-tweets and sub-Twitters of people that have become clients. And the message that I really want to get out, and frankly, why I was so excited to find your podcast, was that you can build literally a worldwide practice, and in my case, from my office at very little to no cost. And I did it back then at no cost because I had no income. I started doing webinars from home to generate a little income. And I remember after about 6 months, someone from London contacted me and he said, "Tell me about all your clients in Houston." And I thought about it a minute and I said, "I don't have any clients in Houston. They're all worldwide." And, with PayPal, all of the administrative tools that are available to you, you can do all of those things literally by yourself from your home. The other thing I had was I had a very niche field, and I focused on that. 2 pieces of advice I got, which were 2 of the best pieces of advice, were the following from a lady named Francine McKenna. She used to be a blogger. She's now with the Wall Street Journal Market Watch. She said, "Don't be like every other lawyer I know and take any piece of work that comes in. If this is the niche you want, you focus on that niche." And she said, "You've got to give it at least 6 months, but really a year." And so I took both of those pieces of advice to heart. And after about 7 months, I went through a progression of on a walker, on crutches, and a cane. I got enough strength where I could travel to a conference. And I went to my first compliance conference, and everyone's response was, "Oh, you're Tom Fox. We wondered who that guy was." And then that led to some major assignments that I was able to get. And it really took off at about 10 months. And I've had a very successful practice in that area since that time.
There is so much good stuff there. And so much of what you're saying, Tom, I don't know if you're a fan of Gary Vaynerchuk. I reference him a lot, but a lot of what you're saying is all kind of things that he preaches and has been talking about. But you were doing that stuff 10 years ago, like the Twitter and retweeting everyone. He talks about how you can like people's posts on Instagram and comment on their posts, and then you'll get a lot of follows, and making sure that you're going kind of in your area and building up an audience that matches what you're trying to do. And that's all stuff you were doing, which is really cool to hear that those are things that have worked and are standing the test of time in the digital marketing world.
I think it's still exciting today because the things that early in my career I always wrote and spoke. So I would submit articles, and it was a 6 to 9 month process, and you get approved and you get some publicity out of that. You might get a call, you might get a client. But with social media, you can just literally put yourself on the map. The other thing I did was my daughter at that point was age 12. And I remember I told her, I said, "Honey, if you could set me up with a Facebook business page in 24 hours, I'll give you $100. 20 minutes later, she came back and said, "Okay, Dad, where's my 100? And
Easiest $100 she ever made.
Hire an expert. People ask me, "Well, how do you get set up?" I said, "Do you have a teenager? Go ask them. They'll get you set up." And so I was able to use my daughter's expertise in social media simply as a tweener and then teenager, now in college, to help me facilitate this worldwide empire.
Yeah. And I think some of the other more subtle things I think that you alluded to, and maybe you can talk more about, is, we hear a lot of lawyers, experienced lawyers, very good lawyers that say things like, "I've tried to do the internet thing and it didn't work," or "I don't have time to do it." And one of the things I think that is so important that you mentioned is like, it does take time, right? I mean, have to invest the time to get started. You have to do the research. You have to find who the people are that you want to engage with. And so maybe kind of talking about how that worked for you and what the time investment looked like. And it sounded like maybe you had more time than some lawyers had just from the circumstances of your story. But talk to us about if you were to advise someone that's maybe a more experienced lawyer is making a shift in their approach to client development. They're a little bit on the fence. They're, I've tried Twitter before, but I don't really get it. What are some of the things and tips that you can share in terms of the time investments and, more specifically, what are the types of things and what you're doing on Twitter that you found really helped you get in front of those people?
So with Twitter, it's really simple. It's retweet. It's something that I practice literally to this day because every day I start my day retweeting the top 10 or 15 sites in my space. And I do that religiously. And anyone that I ask, I put together a list. I send them to someone and say, these are the top sites. All you have to do is hit retweet. You don't have to put out any new independent content, just retweet. And it's still to this day, people appreciate that. I've never had anyone criticize me for retweeting their stuff.
Right.
In terms of the research, though, for a lawyer who asks that question, I would say, do you have client alerts? Do you notify your top clients of important developments, either legal, professional, reputational, other industries, other companies within your space, whatever you might do? And almost everyone has done that. We used to call it a newsletter. Now you just take that same information and you can use a variety of tools, Constant Contact, MailChimp. You can send out a newsletter if you want to. If there are people in your space that are known thought leaders, everyone is looking for content and no one will turn down content generally if it's subject matter appropriate. I'm certainly one of those people. I'm always looking for content. And to have someone as a guest post is absolutely something that is well recognized within this space. Francine McKenna was right. You got to give it 6 months. If you do it 2 or 3 times and you don't get a result, you haven't served yourself well. Commit time to it, commit the effort, and the payoff will be back in spades. And at the very least, you will become known as a thought leader within your industry. And that's going to lead to major news outlets contacting you, whether or not you have a PR firm, whether or not you send them things. And what helped put me on the map from that was actually Walmart. Walmart's under a major FCPA investigation. The story broke back in 2012, but what happened was most of the major law firms in the FCPA space did not want to comment on the case because they were trying to get to work. And so as the reporters went down through their list, I was a B or C-er, and they got to me. And so I was on NPR. And, that never hurts to be on NPR. And that really put me up into the A-listers for other commentary. So things like that, they're not things you can plan, but certainly they're serendipitous. But if you put your name out there and you're confident in, your niche, I think positive things will happen.
Yeah. And I think another thing that strikes me about your story, and it goes to the niche thing, but another common thing we hear from lawyers is, oh, well, my clients, they're not online. They're not doing this stuff. Describe for us your clients. You don't have to reel any specific clients, but talk to us about who your audience is so that our listeners get a sense of, my hunch is that this isn't just average legal services consumer. These are sophisticated business people, and you're finding that they're online. Right?
Absolutely. For someone to say my clients aren't online is absolutely 110% incorrect. Everybody is online. And what happens if you put yourself online as a thought leader, when a problem happens, a general counsel, a chief compliance officer, a business reputation, a business analyst, they're going to start doing research. And when your name pops up on Google searches in the top 3 or 4 pages on FCPA, you're going to start getting calls. And it's simply putting your name out there and people will find you. The number of people who find me for things I wrote years ago still stuns me. And on LinkedIn has become a great tool for communicating to other business professionals. But the internet is the primary method that people find lawyers or other professionals to deal with everything from a criminal violation down to, how do I rewrite my code of conduct?
So speaking of LinkedIn, how are you using LinkedIn to find these people in your network? Because I know that it's one that there are a lot of B2B lawyers who find great success with it. And they are building up their clientele. They love it. They have a huge network. And then there are a bunch of other segments, even still B2B lawyers who are like, oh, LinkedIn is done. I don't use it. Nobody uses it. So what are your tips there for how you can actually gain traction and have an engaged audience?
So my experience with LinkedIn has been extraordinarily positive. To say LinkedIn is done or people aren't on LinkedIn is certainly not what is happening in the client space. People post articles. I post on there every day. Every blog I post, every podcast I post on LinkedIn. I get a fair number of comments. I connect with everyone in the compliance space because that information is available on their profile. So I try to have as broad a network as is possible. But LinkedIn is one of the best platforms for learning, for putting out information to show you're a thought leader, and for putting yourself out there to be data mined by someone who's looking for that type of information.
You know, it sounds like you're doing something really right that I think a lot of people aren't quite sure how to do. And that's you give so much before you even ask for anything. And it doesn't seem like you're even asking for anything. When you're retweeting, when you're putting all of this information out there, you're just giving, giving, giving. And that helps so much with people wanting to engage with you because they don't think that you're trying to take anything away from them.
So my position is I will give anything to anyone to any time for any reason. And it's always been my position. Now, within the compliance space, there are no trade secrets. There's no secret sauce. Everyone knows what to do. It's just how do you do it in your organization? I understand if it's confidential. I understand trade secrets and all of those things. But you're absolutely right. My policy has always been to give it away, and it's paid back in spades.
Yeah, and that's another one that we hear all the time is that, how are we supposed to go online and have these conversations when, I don't want to give away my secret sauce? And I think that, there are certainly, we can all imagine practice areas and parts of a practice that, of course, you don't want to be talking about online. But it seems to me that there's just so much more to be gained from sharing. And the downside in terms of offering, an opinion or help or a tip or some kind of suggestion, they just far outweigh those risks. And I'm glad to hear you validate that for those that are listening and thinking, oh, I can't give away my secret sauce of how I do this.
Yeah. And I had a conversation with a group of lawyers actually last week talking about creating content and the kinds of topics to put out there. And they were saying, oh, but all of this stuff has been done before. This has been written about. And yeah, maybe it has. There really isn't a secret sauce anymore. There probably isn't stuff on the internet that isn't already published, but it hasn't come from you yet. And you haven't given your opinion or haven't weighed in or given your particular analysis. And yeah, and so I think all the stuff that you're putting out there, Tom, you have your podcast, you have books, you have all these blog posts you're doing. You're not trying to reinvent the wheel. You're just giving information and your experience on all of those topics.
That's a great point. And I'm almost embarrassed to say I hadn't thought of phrasing it that way because early on I met with officials with the Department of Justice who prosecute cases in this area of the law. And one of the questions I asked them is, am I talking too much about the same stuff? And they looked at me and said, keep saying the same thing over and over and over and over. We want that message to get out. And it's led to, literally almost 10 years later, I can write on something else with a fresh spin on it, and somebody else, it intrigues someone or helps someone. So saying the same thing over and over, I don't think there's really any downside if you repackage it.
That's right. And again, like just to reiterate Kelly's saying, like your knowledge, skill, and experience are unique to you. That's not something that anybody else can replicate. And that's the competitive advantages that you have when you're in a business that's knowledge-based and service-based. And I think, so many lawyers get into this trap of like commoditizing themselves and forget that the real value of what they have is that knowledge, skill, and experience.
That's absolutely right. And the knowledge-based economy is where we're heading. And lawyers need to be a part of that leadership because if you're not, you're absolutely right. It's going to be a commodity-based proposition.
One of the things that I think would be valuable for folks to hear about, for those that are buying into the idea, but they're having trouble, maybe this is probably more of a general productivity issue for them, but maybe you could share some ideas and tips in your experience with how do you schedule your content production? Maybe you can go through maybe like an average day, a week, a month. Do you have a schedule? Do you commit to a certain amount of certain types of content or publications? Maybe just kind of walk through your day, week, month on an average basis.
Let's start with Twitter because that's actually the easiest and the most straightforward. 15 minutes every morning, and that's just retweeting. Simply that. I have my list. They're on my favorites. I just go down Chrome and retweet I read their blog post and retweet it. So it's a great way for me to start my day with fresh information with the people I respect within this industry. When I started my blog in 2010, I did it 3 days a week. And I really struggled with learning or unlearning how to write like a lawyer because my first blog posts were written by a lawyer for a lawyer with citations and all of the things that we were all taught to do. And it took me a good year to really unlearn that skill and write like a normal person, as I would say. On productivity, the second year, I made the commitment to myself to blog every day. And that actually made it easier and more straightforward because writing a blog every day just became part of my workday. So I had to set aside time to do that. I write best sort of in late morning and understanding that practice of law is always great. If you don't have to worry about clients, sometimes they get in the way. And I couldn't blog then. And there were times, yes, I was up late at night or early in the morning, but those times became fewer and fewer as I became more disciplined and I became better at writing blog posts. And for content, literally it's from today's newspapers. There's always a story I can relate to. If it wasn't a story in the newspaper, my absolute fallback was I would take one of my 10 or 20 books on this subject. I would hold it up sort of eye level and drop it. Whatever page it fell to on the floor, that's what I'd write about. And no one, and let me repeat this, no author will ever criticize you for writing about their book if you cite. I've never had anyone emailing me and say, oh, you couldn't write about that. They all are appreciative. So that expanded my network. It got me this, I'd say it's really an example of Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours because all of this research I did to write blogs really made me much more proficient in the field of compliance simply because I took the time to do it. So that's really how I do it. Now I've fallen into podcasting in a very large way. So I spend most of my time on podcasts, which are, as you know, a lot more time intensive. But on blogging, just make it part of your workday. And I can crank out a blog in 30 minutes because you're only looking at 800 to 1,000 words. And if it's something you know and something you love, and I wrap my blogs around either sort of history, movies, current events. This week, I wrote about, it turned out to be obituary week. It was John McCain on Monday. It was Neil Simon on Tuesday. On Wednesday, it was Ed King, guitarist for Lynyrd Skynyrd. And yesterday it was, or today rather, George Andre, who was part of the original Doomsday defense for the Dallas Cowboys, because I grew up a Cowboy fan. Someone asked me, why do you always write about, people who've died or those sorts of things? I said, science is largely about people. And I find the story of people endlessly fascinating. And my readers tell me that if there's a hook about John McCain and I wrote about integrity, they'll remember some integrity because they think of John McCain or whatever story I'm telling that day. So for me, it's a lot of fun to write about those sorts of things. Writing next week is going to be an Emily Bronte week on Wuthering Heights, which is a bit of a stretch for me, but it's still fun for me to go back and reread things I haven't read since high school. I can take one sentence literally and I can get 5 pieces of content out of that. So I can write a blog, I can do a podcast out of that. And the reason I'm doing these 1-week series is that's 5 podcasts, that's 5 blogs, that becomes a white paper at the end of the week, that becomes an ebook. So the amount of time I spend, it might seem like a lot, but the content I can generate out of that really serves me well in a variety of forums that people want to consume.
And so clearly some of this is practice. You have a lot of years of practice of having this be part of your day and part of your schedule, and it's just something you do. But I think one other thing that I know lawyers struggle with is the perfection aspect of how am I supposed to write a blog post every day because I need it to be this perfect thing that's perfectly researched, that has no, ethical violations or any of these issues or on and on and on. And so how do you do this every day and let go of that need to have it be this perfect article that's going to get you just the right client?
So you can't let the perfect get in the way of the good. But I was very fortunate. I think it was about my 3rd or 4th year of practice. I worked for a very challenging partner who took a look at my work. And after 9 or 10 drafts, she said, here's the deal, Tom, you get 2 drafts. I don't care what you put in it, 2 drafts. And so that experience led me to, okay, I got 2 drafts. Whatever I can do, that's got to be the best. So that's really how I had to overcome that. But when I started my career, I was exactly that, 10 drafts of everything. And so I became much more efficient for that reason.
One other thing that not really maybe a change of topic, but I'm just curious about, how did you discover the niche that you're in? I imagine, well, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be presumptuous. I was going to say, I imagine as a young boy, you weren't passionate about FCPA compliance, but I think it's important for folks to understand how I'm guessing there's some intentionality behind that, but maybe you just talk about, I'll stop talking. You can tell us a little bit about how you got into that niche.
Unfortunately, there's not much intentionality to anything I do. And this example is one more in a long line of those things. So I was an in-house lawyer with Halliburton. My assignment was transactional work. I went all over the world doing contracts. And I moved to a general counsel position of a company who had sustained an FCPA violation in 2006, I guess. So this was now 2007. And I was brought in after everything had been resolved, settlement documents, and I was part of the initial implementation team for the new compliance program. And we were charged with design, implement, and creation of a compliance program. We had a Department of Justice appointed monitor. We had DOJ oversight. And that's how I fell into this niche, literally because of that. I didn't take that job for that reason. I took that job because I wanted the gold bars of a general counsel. And so that I just sort of fell into it that way. After my cycling career ended, and I was trying to figure out what area of law to practice in 2010, there were very few lawyers in private practice who did what I had done in-house, which is the nuts and bolts of compliance, designing, creating, and implementing a best practices compliance program. At that time, most private practice lawyers either did FCPA investigations or negotiated with the government. To do investigations, that's a body-intensive work, meaning you need bodies, you need a law firm. And if you're going to negotiate with a DOJ, I'm a big believer that you need to have been a DOJer. I've been in private clubs before, but I'm not in that club. I've never been in the criminal side of things. I've always worked on the civil side. So I focused on that niche. And although I can do investigations, I don't. I always turn them down or refer them to a lawyer or a law firm that can handle that. I don't negotiate with the government. If somebody's in that kind of problem, I'll refer them to somebody else. And so when I went out in this iteration of my practice, I really focused on that niche, which is being a resource to the in-house compliance practitioner. And at least in 2010, there weren't too many, I didn't have too many competitors.
Sometimes the path chooses you. So I think it's a great way of for folks to know how that happens.
Well, if that guy hadn't hit me, that guy driving the Hummer hadn't hit me, you and I probably wouldn't be talking today.
So I want to talk about your podcast for a couple minutes. I listened to one of your latest episodes, and in the intro, you said you have over 1,000 episodes, which is amazing considering that I think this will be episode 20 for us. And so I'm just blown away that you can record that many episodes, and hopefully Gyi will get there. But the other thing is like the crazy cool topics that you come up with and relate them to compliance. You have all of these episodes on King Arthur, on Shakespeare, Sherlock Holmes, like you've talked about all that. So how are you coming up with this stuff? Like that is just incredible to me.
So this month I'm celebrating 1,000 podcasts. So called this month the land of 1,000 podcasts. I just love the art of storytelling. I see compliance literally in everything, and everything you just named, King Arthur, Shakespeare, Sherlock Holmes. I can take those stories and relate them to a point in compliance. And I think that's one of the reasons to the extent I've had success, both in podcasting and blogging, it's because I'm not preaching, I'm telling stories. And I'm telling stories about how someone can take a point and relate that in a way that their employees, their workforce, the customers of a chief compliance officer are the employees in a company. So how do you sell? And I spent a lot of time reading about how do you market? How do you sell? People want that type of information. And I think chief compliance officers and compliance practitioners do. But I just love storytelling, and I love relating something that I'm studying to a point about compliance. So I have a lot of fun doing that.
You know, you mentioned Malcolm Gladwell earlier and thinking about teaching and relating all of these ideas. I want to know, because you're doing all of these really interesting, different variety of things, who else are you learning from? Where do you have book recommendations or other things for people where you're learning from to get all of these awesome ideas that you have?
Well, I've learned from you guys. I listened to your first podcast, which was re-released on my birthday. That's why I noticed it. So on July 9th, I listened to a ton of podcasts. I listen to sports podcasts. I listen to business podcasts. I listen to true crime podcasts. I listen to I'm a huge Star Trek fan, Star Trek podcasts. I listen to podcasts about authors. I'm a voracious learner, and I always have been. My parents were teachers, and they embedded that in me. So I read constantly. I read history. I read fiction. I read business books. I listen to college professors on tape, or not tape anymore, but it used to be tape. So I listen to that. I don't consume audiobooks because I enjoy podcasts now more, just sort of free-flowing form. I really enjoy both consuming and producing. I just listen, and learn.
So I have a couple really important questions for you. The first one is, which Star Trek are you most interested in? Original, Next Generation, a different series?
So the Star Trek you love is the one you grew up with, and I grew up on episode 1 of the original series. I still can remember its premiere in September of 1966.
Okay, and I think that that maxim is true because I'm a Next Generation guy.
Okay.
I appreciate a lot of the other ones, but and now it's funny because I've gone back and I think they're all available on Netflix, so I've been watching them again. I still love them, but it's so funny to have the experience of now 20 years later of looking back and being like, wow, like the some of the acting and the dialogue, it's like not quite as good as I remember it, but still so the principles and the the underlying themes of the show it really resonate with me on the Next Generation. My second really important question is, I notice, and so for listeners, we actually have video on that we can see each other, and I'm noticing in the background that Tom has a maize and blue winged helmet.
Oh my gosh, this was going to be a topic that I was going to bring up. Oh, because I noticed on Tom's LinkedIn that you guys have something in common.
Well, so not quite, because I'm not as smart as Tom. So I did my undergrad at Michigan. Tom went to Michigan Law School. But even more passionate than I am about Star Trek: The Next Generation, I am about Michigan football. And so I would like to get Tom's thoughts on what he thinks of this coming season, as well as in specifically this weekend's game against Notre Dame.
So, yes, I am U of M Law, University of Texas undergrad, with an interim stop at Michigan State for graduate school. So, yeah, I've been debating with some buddies from law school about Harbaugh this week. Mm-hmm. And I really think that at that level, how you're reviewed turns on how you do in big games. So I have faulted Harbaugh for losing Ohio State, Michigan State, Notre Dame, you name the team. However, his record is, I think, 10-3. He's averaged 10-3 over the last few years. So his record is not one that is really subject to a lot of criticism. Having said that, I must confess, I absolutely hate Notre Dame with a passion. They have trounced every school I've been to. I will never forget January 1, 1978, when they beat Texas in the Cotton Bowl for the national championship game. Still my worst defeat ever in all sports. So,
were you at that game?
Yes.
Well, I can understand your feelings.
I've been to several Michigan Notre Dame games over the years, so hopefully we will win. But
any predictions? What's your prediction this season? How many games are we going to win, or alternatively, how many are we going to lose?
So
this is
I'm
the
gonna
last Michigan football question you get, Gyi.
Yeah,
that's fair.
So I can't remember if it's 12 or 13 games this season for Michigan, but I'm going to go with 11 wins. Predict to win over Notre Dame, but I would never predict a Notre Dame win. So that one's easy. But I think Ohio State may be a little down this year, particularly with their current issues. And Michigan State is really, I think, going to be off the radar.
Well, sir, I hope you're correct. Go blue.
So yes.
All right. So I have one last question that I think this might take a little time to answer. So, and I also have a little bit of a drawn out intro to go into it. So I often say on here that a little bit, hopefully not disparaging, but just talking about the lawyers who are like, I have, 50 years of experience and I've been doing this for a long time and call me because I'm the best. And you are a very experienced lawyer. You've been doing this for 35 years. You have all of this great stuff in your background that gives you this expertise. And one of the things that I want to know, you mentioned earlier that you had your daughter set up your Facebook page for you, and you are clearly open to learning all of these new methods and different things that you can do to market your practice. So I want to know what advice you have for other experienced lawyers out there who are saying, I've been doing this for a long time. I am a little set in my ways because this is how I've always marketed my firm. This is how I've always done things. How can you break out of that and learn and challenge yourself to do these new, different marketing practices for the digital age?
So a couple of different thoughts, I guess. The first is that I find this an incredibly exciting time to be a lawyer. We have tools available to us. I find the fact that I could create an international practice literally from my house, just nothing short of amazing. Things like that still drive me. As I said, I'm a voracious learner. Although I'm fairly basic in my tech skills, if you have a wife or a daughter who's very good at it, it certainly enhances your ability to do so. And I just find it incredibly exciting to be able to reach out to people literally across the world to talk about my passion, which is anti-corruption compliance, and why that I am a part of the worldwide fight against bribery and corruption. So that drives my passion, is that area, but it's learning. It's learning about new things. And for those lawyers who don't want to engage in this, it's time to hang it up. You're going to be left behind. Even the top, blue chip firms have robust social media programs. They have robust social media platforms. They are putting out podcasts. They are putting out client alerts. They are putting out whatever you want to call it. It's a social media tool, and it's out there for somebody to find. The top lawyers use it. I'm a solo practitioner. I use it. And you can enhance whatever you want to do in your practice by using this. Like I said, if you don't know how to do it, go see your teenager. Get your nephew. They would love to help you. My daughter absolutely loved being a part of this effort, and she's in college now, but she still helps me produce podcasts. And we're getting ready to do a new podcast series where she's going to participate in it. So there's ways to do this. There's ways to engage. For me, it's working with my daughter, which is something I love. But for a lawyer in this competitive environment, you have to use the tools that are available to you if you're going to compete. It is simply table stakes to be a subject matter expert. In any space, there are going to be tons of subject matter experts. So how are you going to set yourself out differently? And because of the subject matter in my space, I put myself out there as a subject matter expert, and the marketplace has responded. And I think the same will be true for any other market space. But if you're not willing to or don't want to put the time into this, you're going to be left behind. And that's just the reality of the nearly 2020 marketplace we're in. I mean, we're 20 years into this century. And it's the things that you did in the 1980s and 1990s are not going to work in 2020.
Yeah, as Gyi mentioned, we are on video, and he and I are both nodding furiously as Tom is saying all of this stuff. And it's all true. And I appreciate that perspective so much. And I think it's something that needs to get shouted from the rooftops even more than it already is.
Well, I'm one of the people that does that. So, but I love doing this. I mean, I love working with people like you guys. And I love it that you are taking this message about how you can market it. And I think your theme was, it was around a lunch theme. So you were talking about what were you having for lunch? And that's the perfect way to talk about marketing of legal services. It's because it's just a conversation. I tell people that a podcast is just a virtual cup of coffee with Tom. We're going to sit down and you're going to tell me about what you love, what your specialty is, or what you're passionate about, and no one will turn you down for that.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure for folks that are, want to get into the nitty gritty of how Tom's pulling some of this stuff off, we'll make sure that you've got some links in the show notes to your podcast, blog posts, and some of your books, because it really, I think for a lot of people, even when they start to embrace the concepts, it's really helpful for them to see the specifics of what a lawyer, an expert like yourself, is putting out there so they can get a sense of how to start tackling some of this. So thank you so very much for taking the time to participate in this podcast and sharing your wealth of knowledge. I encourage folks to follow Tom on Twitter and connect with him on various other like LinkedIn and whatnot, just because, again, this is someone who has really embraced this and has really, as he's talked about, built a global practice using primarily the web. So impressive.
Well, thanks very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Tom. To all our listeners, if you have topic ideas or guest suggestions, feel free to send them to us. Like you mentioned earlier, Tom reached out to us to say that he liked what we were doing and had his own podcast and connect on those sorts of things. And so we thought he'd be a great guest for our show, and it turns out he was. So subscribe to the podcast and leave a review or comment if you have one.